as I told you before, in the interpretation of dispositive as a conceptual tool, the metaphor proposed by Deleuze is very important. And in particular, and I think this is important to be stressed in relations with other similar conceptions of social or even non-only social assemblage, such as Paulo has arrived just in time, just as the one proposed, for example, by the actor network theory, but also from other conceptions, is the idea that, of course, coherently with the role of the power, of the role of government, this kind of assemblage is also particularly linked to a preponderance of balances of forces. That means that we could highlight the direction of power in a certain context, at a certain moment, in a certain kind of relation, but we should also recognize the chance of the reversibility of this kind of relations. And another interesting thing is the possibility to understand the dispositive as well located both at the micro and the macro level. And this is, I think, very important because in this respect, leadership can be understood as a policy dispositive at the macro level, for example, in terms of competition policies between the schools, in terms of accountability, in terms of enacting a new reform, let's say, but also at the level, at the micro level of organization relations. In every single school. In this way, Groen has spoken of leadership design, intending that the leadership, and this mainly pertains to your arguments, as a way to introduce, as a way to sustain neoliberal restructuring schools. And Gillis, which is another Foucauldian scholar in the field of education, has noticed as leadership is a tool designed for a particular purpose. It is designed to achieve what might not otherwise be achieved. And it is relevant, this with the changing in the conception of leaders. So, because the literature about educational leadership, but I would say about educational head teachers, about school head teachers, about educational manager, about principals as professional primus inter pares, and so on, has been widespread among different disciplinary fields, and so also among a very widespread literature during the years, especially during since the 70s, I should say. There have been different kind of trials to map, to systemize this relevant production of literature and research about educational leadership. By my point of view, the most important ones were from Groen and Ribbins, which at the beginning of the 80s have proposed a very relevant way to look at educational leadership, and I will come back later on. And very recently, Helen Gunter from the University of Manchester, who is a very scholar about education leadership, has proposed another way of looking at theories about educational leadership in a book of 2016. Also discussing critical leadership studies. When I met for the first time this relevant diffusion of literature about educational leadership, I also was struck by the Seddon's contribution, who tried to distinguish two different conceptions of educational context. The one which is very I could say sympathetic with the positivistic or post-positivistic methodology and paradigms, which is called a categorical, and I will show you how. And the other one is the idea of a relational educational context. And I have tried to explore another discursive dimension, and I refer to the idea of discourses, of regimes of truth. I think it is not relevant at the moment to distinguish exactly between discourses and regime of truth, because it is very complicated. So, just to recall some main features of the educational discourses, we could recall Olsen and other colleagues' contribution. They have tried to stress the distinction between the welfarist discourses or the bureaucratic professional compromise in a certain way, and the neoliberalist, or let's say the managerialist approach to education policy. And the last one is the democratic critic discourse. And also in this case, the distinction between democratic and critic means something, but I will try to clarify more later on. So, just to give you another idea of the distinction between the main features of welfarist discourse and new managerialist discourse, this is a table from research by Gewirtz and Ball, and I think it is very clear about the differences between different dimensions of this kind of discourses. About the critical one, I will come back later. So, the way I propose to read educational leadership is a way to answer to your question, because it could be this kind of conception of theories about leadership could be located also historically. So I could say that in a certain way this is the idea pertaining to the 60s, 70s main conception of educational leadership. This is the idea, especially the idea of transformational leadership is appeared during the 80s and 90s, and it is very interesting to notice that the conception of a transformational role of the leadership derived explicitly from managerial paradigms. But what is important to me at the moment is trying to stress the differences between the categorical idea of leadership, and in this case we could say that the idea of leadership is pertaining to an ontology of the human. So the leader couldn't be nothing else than a man, that a woman, who lives the role, who enacts the role. So you need to see at the main features of the individual, of the physical individual. Or at least, in some context, you could enrich this kind of ontology of the human, trying to looking at the relationship between the single leader and the typical followers. What can be called as middle management, for example, as senior leadership staff, okay? And the other conception is focused on a sort of ontology, of practice ontology, coherently with the idea deriving from Foucault, as I told you before. So in this case, what is interesting is the assemblage. What is interesting in this case is the complex interrelation between humans, non-humans, and I could say that from my point of view, for example, the distance between this kind of hypothesis of looking at an ontology of practice within confronting with the case of actor-network theory is mainly related to the conception of power, let's say. But from the other point of views, there are a lot of similarities, and I will try to show you later how it happens. It really happens in research. So the typical idea of a school leader was during the 60s, during the 70s, or until the 70s, the idea of instructional leadership, which main exponent has been Leithwood. The moral leadership, the idea of a moral guide, of a professional guide, and the main author in this case is Ser Giovanni. And it is interesting to notice how while neoliberal paradigms approaches were appearing, some of the authors have tried to move progressively from this conception to this one. For example, in the case of Leithwood, you could see how it moved from the instructional to the transformational idea, and then very lately he approached also the idea of distributed leadership, together with Alma Harris, who is one of the main exponents of this approach to leadership. Another thing that, well, let's say something about these cells styles of micropolitics. Micropolitics was the reading of the role of the leadership in schools by critical exponents, such as Stephen Bowles himself. And in this kind, and I think this is the main reason because Stephen doesn't like it so much anymore, was in a certain way very well located in a human ontology, because it was pertaining the role of the leaders, the idea that the style of leader could be changed from, for example, an authoritarian to an interpersonal kind of attitude, and so on. And another idea is the idea of micropolitics or collaborative leadership proposed by other scholars, which could focus very much, especially on leadership interaction. I will show you something about the idea of collaboration thanks to a research I've conducted by myself. And I will try to explain even why I don't feel very well comfortable in this kind of cell. I have tried to practice this kind of research because it's a way to practice the main truth, the main regime of truth, trying to explore as scholars another kind of possibility that obviously I am not agreeing with. Another interesting thing is the idea of distributed leadership. As you can see, it appears in three different cells in terms of distributed in practice, distributed or to be distributed, or in terms of distribution of work. So the same terms, apparently the same concept of distribution could represent different kind of truth. In this case, as I will show you, later, I think, speaking of Spillane, this is very well located in a legacy about an ontology of praxis. in this kind, the idea of distribution, as it is practiced mainly by Alma Harris, Day, Latewood, when he moved from the instructional to the distribution, is something that conceives power as a real thing. One thing, a thing that could be shared, for example, among the leader and the staff, the leader and the middle manager. It's a way of delegating something. And the idea of system leadership is very well connected with the idea of this leadership distribution, because in this case, especially during the 90s and the beginning of the millennium, let's say the last decade, it was proposed a sort a leadership dispositive in terms of networks of school, where a sort of super leader was forced to enact in terms of leaders for all the schools of the same network. So we have superhero, superman, or superwoman in a school, who distributes power. But in a network of school, we have a superhero, a super distribution of powers, let's say. And another thing very interesting is the idea of distribution from a critical or a democratic point of view, which stresses mainly the practices, the daily practices of leadership. So in this case, thanks to very important research, one was conducted by Pat Thompson about the stressful role of the leader in a book which is Blocks in the Head, something like that, where I quoted it in the paper I sent you. And another scholar who stressed the greedy leadership was Peter Gron. And so in this kind of conception, what is important in terms of leadership is this not a role, it is not a human ontology, it is the real way thanks the practices of distribution are really enacted. Another interesting thing is this kind of absence. Why? Why it is so difficult to conceive of, in terms of an ontology of practices in this case? Because of course in this kind of view it is absolutely needed to think of a human, of a precise role of the leaders, because of the complexity of the neoliberal paradigms. For example, and as I will show you later, because it is very well linked to the idea of school evaluation, for examples. And well, about the idea of no leadership at all, I will come back later. And of course, there are a lot of, I could say that in a certain way, this, only this cell could be explored thanks to the contribution of research, of approaches from different scholars. For example, Pat Thompson, together with Ellen Gunter and Gilles Blackmore from the University of Melbourne, have recently edited a collection of books about the role of critical philosophers in stressing the capacity of leadership, but also of other educational professionals in terms of resisting to the neoliberal pressures. But this is a very important to be discussed later. So I said enough about the idea of individual ontologies. What it could be stressed is the relevant absences from the idea, for example, of distributed leadership or of the role of the context. And it is very interesting to notice how this concept is really made in practices in terms of research and in terms of policy, for example, evaluation or policy other kind of enactments. And I will show you the picture because I think it is more clear than the words. Yes, clearer than the words. This is a very, I think, I should say, for what I know, this is the most important research on educational leadership conducted during the last decade. From they and other colleagues, among them Litwood, Alma Harris, Hargraves. It is quoted in the all the quotations are in the paper I sent you, and you could see how it is needed to think of leadership in a very individualistic and ontological way, because you should locate at a certain point something which is called leadership or distributed leadership. For example, this one, senior leadership team, staff. At the moment I don't remember exactly what it means. We could check later. And the idea of an ontology of human is very important because you could locate a single man or woman or an interaction of men and women as educational professional in terms of intervening variables among another set of variables. But in the end, what is very important, it is to try to identify how a single policy enacted by one leader or another one could be more or less effective in terms of producing this kind of outcomes. And I think that another interesting point is to look at the single variables, because for the most parts they are the results of opinions. They are the results of survey methodologies. So very well on the survey, on the surface, sorry, of the social relations in school. So I would like to show you. This is an example. All the dimensions are deriving from questionnaire items, from opinions, from attitudes, which are combined in very sophisticated ways, such as through factor analysis and then, of course, equal linear regression models. But they look explicitly at a very surface of the school life. And anyway, they are depending on humans, even collecting data, okay? Sorry. Now, sorry if it is Italian, but it is a way of connecting the previous research from Day and colleagues with the presentation of Emiliano this morning. As you can see, this is the Italian translation in terms of conceptual tools, but when you will see how it is translated in terms of research, you will look at the same methodological paraphernalia, let's say, of the other kind of research. I think that the common Latin roots let you to understand that we have managerial processes, operational processes, results, and outcomes in a certain way. And the idea is the idea of a causal linearity, of course. And it derives from the European quality management. Let me just recall you how the methodological paraphernalia of this kind of conception could be enacted, translated also in the very micro conception of the practices of schools. These are single leaders of single laboratories of Math 1, Math 2, Math 2, Math 3, and they are trying to map the development of capacity of the students in terms of every single practice. So, I think this is very interesting to know. This is a way of producing truth. It is a way of producing truth, regulating ourselves. And this is the research I've tried to operationalize. As you can see, the logic is the same of the previous one. So, if you are collecting data, able to collecting data from opinions of humans, it is very, very simple to produce some kind of results, some kinds of way of interrogating a reality. I used a data set provided by psychologists who collected lot of data from the perception of teachers, and then combining the variables thanks to factor analysis and path analysis. In the end, I have tried to operationalize the idea of leadership cooperation. And I also tried to look at what could be said in terms of consequences of result. It is very easy in a certain way.